start, in the beginning of the pandemic, we tried to compare the current situation to others from the past, from economic to health crisis. Now that we have further information, how do you differ this global health pandemic and what does it tell us?
I think to summarize this year of pandemic very briefly, I would say it was scientific success coupled with political failure. From a scientific perspective, it was really an amazing year. Humanity has never been so powerful, so able to understand and to stop the pandemic. You know, in previous big epidemics in history, humanity was almost completely helpless. When the Black Death spread and killed millions in the 14th century, nobody understood what was happening or how to stop the disease. Similarly, when Europeans came to America in the 15th and 16th century, they brought with them diseases from the old world, like smallpox, that spread throughout America and killed up to 90% of the population, the native population of America. And again, nobody understood what was happening, what was causing this wave of epidemics, and how to stop them. Even 100 years ago, when the big influenza epidemic of 1918 spread and killed between 50 and 100 million people, scientists were unable to isolate the virus and to find ways to stop it or to develop vaccines. In contrast with COVID, once the alarm bells began ringing at the end of December 2019, that there is some new infectious disease in Wuhan, it took only 2 weeks, that's all, 2 weeks, to identify the virus correctly, to sequence its entire genetic code, and even to develop tests to know who has the virus and who doesn't. And then within a couple of more months, scientists discovered how to effectively slow down and even stop the chains of infection. And within a year, we already have several vaccines, effective vaccines, in mass production. So this is enormous scientific success. But at the same time, we are also seeing political failure. These tools that science gives us, they need to be implemented, they need to be used correctly. And this is not the job of scientists. This is the job of politicians to create policy, to make decisions. And here we saw terrible failure. Some countries did relatively okay, even very well. You look at New Zealand, Australia, Vietnam, Taiwan, you see huge successes. But other countries, like the USA, like Brazil, the response of the federal government was really terrible, leading to hundreds of thousands of preventable deaths. And even more so, we didn't see any global leadership. You didn't see the emergence of any, leader or group of leaders who understand what is happening and seek to protect humanity as a whole and stop the spread of this pandemic all over the world. We had the understanding, we had the tools. Again, this is not the Middle Ages, when people just didn't understand what was happening. We have the tools, we have the knowledge, but we don't have the political wisdom. My country, Israel, is now, I think, the #1 in terms of vaccinating its population. But what people don't realize is that as long as the virus continues to spread in any country around the world, nobody can really feel safe. Even if you vaccinate the entire population, as long as the virus keeps spreading, it undergoes new mutations. There are more and more variations, and there is an increasing chance that some mutation, some variation, will make the virus able to overcome the vaccine, and you will have a new wave of infection. So really, it's not about altruism. It's about your own interest. If you want to protect your own country, you need to protect all the countries. many of the countries which previously used to be these kinds of global leaders, like the USA, in the last few years, they not only resigned the job of global leader, they actually worked deliberately to undermine global cooperation, global institutions. Like in the middle of the pandemic, the United States withdrew support from the World Health Organization. This is absolutely crazy. I want to emphasize it's a political issue. If you see the pandemic continuing to spread and even becoming worse, this is because we still lack the political wisdom. We still are making bad political choices.
Did we achieve a peak, or we are going downhill again when we think about globalization?
The more connections you have with airplanes and ships and tourists and people going all over the world, it increases the speed with which viruses and bacteria can travel around the world and infect people. That's absolutely true. But we should realize that pandemics didn't start with the current era of globalization. They have been here for thousands of years before. Again, the example of the Black Death, it was in the 14th century. There were no airplanes, no big cruise ships with hundreds of tourists, and still the Black Death spread from East Asia to Western Europe within 10 years or so, and killed up to 1/3 of the population. That's long before the current era of globalization. If you really want to go back to a time when there are no pandemics, you know when you need to go back to? You need to go back to the Stone Age, to before the agricultural revolution, to before the domestication of plants and animals and the first villages. Because epidemics started with agriculture. Hunter-gatherers did not have epidemics. They lived in very, very small groups, moving constantly over a big territory, and they did not have a lot of contact, close contact with animals. They hunted animals, but they didn't keep animals. They didn't domesticate animals. Now, almost all epidemics start with animals, either with domesticated animals like chickens and pigs, or like with the coronavirus, it starts with a bat, but it's when humans capture them and sell them in markets and so forth that there is a greater chance of infection. And then when one human gets it, if you live in a small hunter-gatherer band and you caught a virus from a bat, that's not too bad. Maybe you're sick. Maybe you infect 10 other people, but that's it. It's over. Once you have agriculture and people living in villages and towns and cities, this is when you really start getting epidemics. What we can do is have better globalization, because globalization is not the reason for these pandemics. It is potentially the solution. The real solution to epidemics is not isolating yourself. It's cooperating with other people. It's sharing information. When scientists and doctors and nurses and people in general in China and Brazil and Israel and the United States, when they freely share information, when they disclose the truth, they give true data and not disinformation and conspiracy theory, when they put their minds together to develop medicines, to understand what is happening, this is the best protection against pandemics. Again, not isolation, cooperation. So if globalization is only about competition, then it's only making things worse. But if we can create a good kind of globalization, which is about cooperating and not just about competition, then it is the solution. It's the only real defense against future pandemics, is to build a global network, a global system of monitoring and preventing pandemics, which must cover everybody, not just the rich countries. It must cover the poorest people in the poorest countries if it is to be successful. We have the beginning of such a system with institutions like the World Health Organization, but we need to give them a lot more money and also some more political power to be more effective. Now, I don't think, of course, they shouldn't become a government. Ultimately, it's the job of politicians elected by the citizens to make the important decisions. But we do need some kind of system to collect data and issue warnings about the dangers and the spread of new infectious diseases. Otherwise, the politicians may not make the right decisions and not make decisions quick enough. Fake news have one big advantage, or conspiracy theories have one big advantage over scientific truth. The truth is often complicated and painful. People often don't want to hear the truth. And because it makes you feel uneasy.
Especially the current truth,
very
right?
Complicated. Sorry?
Especially the current truth.
Yes. And, just to understand what a virus is, it's such a complicated thing. A virus is it's not an animal, it's not a living organism, it's not even a cell. A virus cannot eat, a virus doesn't reproduce by itself. A virus is just a bit of biological code, a bit of genetic code that has the amazing ability to infiltrate the cells of my body, hijack the mechanisms of my cells, until the cells in the body start producing more copies of me. And then you have more copies of this biological code which infect other cells, and this is how it goes viral. One thing very important, which we now see in this epidemic, is the crucial importance of free press, of freedom of expression. In normal times you have all these arguments, but in a pandemic it's so clear what an important thing it is to have freedom of expression. All these arguments about the vaccines, are they safe, not safe? I trust vaccines that come from democratic countries that have freedom of press and freedom of expression, because I know that, in a dictatorship, when the government has an interest to hide something, they can hide it. But in a democracy, even if the government has an interest to hide some inconvenient truth from the citizens, this is when it's very important you have a free press which tells you the truth, even if the government doesn't like it. And we see now in the pandemic the huge difference between a situation when you can trust the information you receive and in a situation when you don't know, because the government is controlling all the newspapers, all the radio, all the television, so I'm not sure if I'm getting the truth about the pandemic and the vaccines and everything, or I'm just getting government propaganda. I think the pandemic has accelerated this process of surveying, monitoring people with digital means. I'm not against surveillance. It can be an important tool in fighting the pandemic or future pandemics and other problems, but it must be regulated carefully to protect our privacy and our basic political and human rights. And we don't have a lot of time, so I would focus on three main rules that if these rules are kept, then we can have surveillance without endangering our democratic freedoms or our privacy. The first rule is that if you collect information on me, this information should serve to help me and not to control or manipulate me. It's okay in a pandemic to collect information on millions of people. We need it. but it must be used to help the people. You know, we already have it in the past, like my personal doctor, she knows so many private things about me. And it's okay, because she uses this very private information she has on me to help me, to cure me, to protect me, and maybe also to protect other people. But if my doctor then sells my private information to a corporation to make money on me, or to some political party to manipulate me, that's wrong. And that's obvious. And this should be the same with the new systems of collecting information. So that's the first rule. It should help the people that are monitored, not some third party. The second rule is that whenever you increase surveillance of individuals, you must simultaneously increase surveillance of the government and the big corporations. Surveillance must always go both ways, up, down, and down, up. If surveillance goes only one way, only from the government surveying the citizens or a big corporation monitoring us, that's the road to dictatorship. So, okay, you collect more information about me, that's fine. I want at the same time to have more information about you. Like in this pandemic, governments are spending enormous amounts of money, billions, trillions. I want to have better access to seeing who gets the money and who decides who gets the money. It's important that the government now gives money to businesses, but it should give the money fairly to businesses that really need it, and not to some big corporation whose boss is the friend of a minister. That's corruption. So whenever you increase surveillance of citizens, at the same time increase surveillance against government corruption. And if the government says, no, it's too complicated, this is the middle of a pandemic, how do you expect us to have this new system against corruption? Don't believe it. If it's not too complicated to start following me in the middle of the pandemic, it's not too complicated to start monitoring the government in the middle of the pandemic. It should go both ways. And that's the second rule. And the third rule is that we should never allow too much data on us to be concentrated in any one place. If all the data is accumulated by the government or by some big corporation, again, that's the road to dictatorship. So you should have several different institutions, authorities, organizations. Like in this pandemic, you collect information on the citizens. It shouldn't be the police. Establish an independent health authority, which is separate from the police, and it collects the information and it keeps it separate from the databases of the police or of the big corporations. This year, the COVID year, has not made me very optimistic about our ability to face ecological collapse and climate change. You know, climate change is much bigger than COVID. It's much more complicated than COVID. If we can't organize global cooperation to face the pandemic, then we don't. How much chance do we really have against climate change? So I hope it's not too late. You know, nothing is deterministic. It's still in our hands. So I hope that this pandemic will actually serve as a wake-up call. That look what happens to the world, look what happens to the global economy from one virus, from one bat. I'm not a prophet, I don't know for sure, but when I look at the span of human history, and when I look at developments right now, my impression is that within, say, a century or 2 centuries, 200 years, our species, Homo sapiens, will disappear. Now, I don't think it will necessarily be because of some big catastrophe that kills everybody. I think it will happen gradually through technological changes. developments in two fields in particular. On the one hand, artificial intelligence. On the other hand, bioengineering. These two true revolutionary fields will make it possible to start changing our bodies, our DNA, our brains, our minds, to start re-engineering our organic bodies, and also to start engineering completely new kinds of inorganic entities, entities which are not made from carbon, from organic stuff, like humans and elephants and potatoes, but new kinds of entities. So it's not so much that Homo sapiens will be destroyed in a big catastrophe. It's more that we'll be upgraded or changed into something different